So I want to talk about an interesting ambiguity or contradiction. Well, it's not really a contradiction, but it's a seeming contradiction in some of the ideas of Ramana Maharshi. And in particular, it comes down to some of these distinctions between Samadhi and what he calls laya. So, Samadhi is just a generic word, really, for a state of total absorption. It's a state of total absorption of the mind such that there is in that moment no longer that independent sense of separation between I and what's the not I. Samadhi is only recognized in retrospect. When you're out of Samadhi, then you say, I was in Samadhi. If you say I'm in Samadhi, then you aren't in Samadhi, because the very recognition of that state means that there is an I, which is noticing what's going on, so to say. So, whether there actually is some kind of I in Samadhi, or there isn't, is kind of a theoretical question, much along the lines of, the old Zen koan, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. So similarly, if someone has an experience, but the I is so absorbed in an object of concentration that it cannot be distinguished from it, is there actually an I? And Samadhi is something that can happen in many different states and in many different ways, right? For example, Maharishi often talks about how one can experience Samadhi in a state of faint. One can experience Samadhi in that split second upon waking up before you remember who you are and all the memories descend. Those are states of absorption. One could even view, in some sense, deep sleep as a sort of Samadhi. Now, this thing called laya also essentially means absorption. Laya is that quieting of the mind, that stilling of its restlessness, which can lead to essentially Samadhi. What is looked at retrospectively as a state of bliss. But the problem with laya, and laya can come about from many different means, is that while quietness of mind is a very helpful thing to have, a crucial, a necessary thing to have for the seeker, it does not by itself destroy this thing called ignorance. Ignorance is this very magical, veiling thought that hides, so to say, the self from view, and that leads, therefore, to identification with a false I, the body-mind, and its memories and imaginations and all of that. And that leads to desire, and desire leads to distraction of mind, and distraction of mind keeps the whole game going and going and going, right? So we do want to quiet the distraction of mind, quiet the mind, and there are various ways where we can get to that very quiet mind. But that very quiet mind is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So it's interesting because Maharishi says in certain places, for example, quite famously, and in my opinion, it's often overquoted because I think a lot of people think that their minds are quieter than they actually are. This is a real issue that they have to deal with, which I think it's less common than people think it is, but it is a real issue, of course. So there are ways of stilling the mind. And one can become quite good at them without going one step further. that one step further is to be awake during that stilling process and to inquire one way or the other as to who it is that is experiencing it. We'll get to that in a minute. But Maharishi says in one famous passage, he says, this is a sort of fork that advanced seekers can easily be lost at. One can go down the wrong passage because at a certain point of mental stillness, one can take the route that leads to laya. That is to say, the route that leads to mental quietness, which is enjoyed for its own sake, but does not lead to the destruction of ignorance. So the classic form of this would in fact be a certain kind of samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, samadhi without any cognition or sensation. So the classic form of nirvikalpa samadhi is, sitting down, eyes closed, totally absorbed in concentration on something. Could be any number of things. Could, for example, even be the breath. That would be pranayama. It could be sound. Maharishi talks about nadi meditations, which are sound meditations. But whatever it is, it's eyes closed meditation, which deepens into concentration and deepens into samadhi. And in that state, one doesn't really have perception of the outside world. It is effectively sleep. It is a yogically caused sleep. One can stay in that yogically caused sleep, which I think also goes by the term of yoga nidra. And Maharishi says one can stay there for a very long time, right? And there are stories in the scriptures of people staying there for, 1,000 years. And when they come out of it, they go right back to thinking along the lines of identity. They're still caught by the egoic illusion. Maharishi says, they could enter nirvikalpa samadhi with a trifling thought. And as soon as they exit it, a long time later, that thought comes right back to them. So he says, don't fall into laya, that is to say, don't fall into sleep states, and the classic one of which is sitting down, closed-eyed, meditative, concentrative states that lead to yogic sleep. And this is why I tend to generally caution seekers not to do closed-eyed meditation much, but rather to do inquiry or surrender while open-eyed and while going about life, because that is in fact the real task at hand, basically. Now, there's so many interesting distinctions to be made here. Nirvikalpa samadhi, in that classic sitting sense, is not to be confused with sahaja nirvikalpa samadhi, which is a term that Maharishi also uses. Sahaja means natural. So sahaja samadhi, or sahaja nirvikalpa samadhi, is that same state of total absorption, total bliss, but it's permanent, and it exists while, from the outside, it seems as if the body and the mind are doing things. That state only comes about once ignorance is destroyed. And of course, my usual caveat about how ignorance being destroyed in the end yields the very truth that ignorance was never there to begin with. But anyhow, so we have on the one hand these cautions against falling into yogic sleep. Quietness of mind is helpful. Quietness of mind is not enough, right? In deep sleep, every night we have perfect quietness of mind. And that is in fact a blissful state. The less the restlessness of mind, typically speaking, basically speaking, the greater the bliss. Deep sleep, we have perfect quietness. There are no objects to experience, there's no thoughts, no feelings, and therefore it is a state of perfect bliss. I'm not talking about dreaming, I'm talking about pure dreamless deep sleep. And just like all samadhis, we only know it after we wake up from it. We say, oh, I slept well. It's the classic Vedantic idea that the I doesn't fully disappear in deep sleep. It's very kind of ultra rudimentary, you might say. But it's a semantic question, whether the I really exists or doesn't. The I thought, I should say, whether that really exists or doesn't during deep sleep. I mean, the true I clearly does. So on the one hand, we have these passages, right? The anti-laya ideas, right? Maharishi says it's not enough to have quietness of mind. You want to cultivate quietness of mind, and while the mind is quiet, to stay aware, to stay awake, to not allow the mind to go into a kind of torpor. That vigilance is required to plunge into samadhi deliberately and not to be lost in it, but to keep the eyes open up to the very last point and to inquire, if one is doing surrender or self-inquiry, into who it is that experiences the samadhi. Or if one is, from the surrender point of view, to attempt to ignore even the samadhi, because the samadhi is also a thought. It's also a state, right? Samadhis come and go. The true samadhi doesn't come and go, but the samadhis that we know as samadhis come and go. To bring our mind into that quietness is to bring it into a highly reflective state, which is very helpful for then asking that final question, who is it that's experiencing this quietness of mind? One has slowed the merry-go-round to a near halt, and then you can look around and see that it is a merry-go-round. You can actually look, you can actually see, instead of being spun around dizzy all the time, basically. Or to take the analogy of the intoxicated person in their own home who doesn't recognize that it is their home, right? They calm themselves down into a deeply quiet state, but that's not sufficient. Then they have to actually look around and recognize that they are already home. So on the one hand, we have, as I say, these anti-laya prescriptions, right? On the other hand, we also have passages in Maharishi where he says, and this really goes to show that Maharishi speaks to people where they are, and that his advice has to be understood in context. He says, yes, the state of samadhi is self-realization. He says, yes, the state of peace that one acquires when the mind is quiet, that state of effortlessness, that state of clarity, is the goal. And that peace need not be disturbed. So this, on the surface, looks a little bit contradictory to what we've just been saying, because he seems to be saying, okay, as long as you can get yourself into that state of peace, you're done, finished. So in some of these passages, earlier passages, he's talking about how that temporary peace into which you might fall, or even get yourself into deliberately, is not by itself sufficient. Temporary peace is not sufficient. Temporary states of peace are not sufficient. Even long states of temporary peace are not sufficient. One must be awake and inquire deeply, who is it that experiences that state of peace? Or from the surrender viewpoint, to attempt to surrender even that state of peace, even that samadhi. Essentially, in other words, to discern away or to distinguish even that state of samadhi as just a state. Because it is just a state. It's a reflection of the Supreme. It's a reflection of the self. That's why its characteristic is peace. But those temporary states are simply thoughts still. That's why they're temporary. They're thoughts when we reflect back on them and we make of them a memory. When we are quote unquote in them and we don't actually have a sense of ourselves as separate, one could say that is the self. But the problem is that we exit them, right? We exit them, and that temporary quality is the problem. And the reason it's temporary is because we've lost ourselves along the way. We haven't kept awake and we haven't inquired. This final question as to who it is that's experiencing the quietness. So that quietness, that blankness, that void is insufficient. But as I say, Maharishi in certain passages seems to say peace is enough. Don't disturb peace. Get into a peaceful state. That's sufficient. Just keep getting into a peaceful state. So that's because the vast majority of the obstacles that confront a seeker are what are termed in Vedanta vasanas, mental tendencies, the quote-unquote outward-going tendency of the mind, meaning that tendency of the mind which seeks to gain pleasure and avoid pain through the manipulation of objects in the world, including its own mental objects of thoughts and feelings and so on. The reason those desires and fears seem relevant is because one identifies with the body and the mind. That's the egoic illusion. So the egoic illusion feeds the desires that come out of the illusion, because if I am a body and a mind, then I am these states of pleasure and pain, and I want to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain, and so on and so forth, right? So identity feeds the desires, and then the desires in turn keep the mind restless and distracted so that it can't actually examine the identity, which is a kind of illusion, as we know. And that's how the cycle keeps going. So step one is, for a seeker, is to start turning the mind subtler. What does that mean? It means relatively inward compared to relatively outward. So, at a very crude level, for example, someone who's invested in a life of, I don't know, let's say crime, okay? That person has a very unrefined, and one might say noisy mind, impulsive, distracted, very little sense of concentration. For the most part, maybe there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, right? And so even one step towards a more concentrated mind would be a good thing, right? Which is why all religions, for example, say, adopt certain tenets of morality. Be kind, be generous, be honest. Why? Because these things reduce inner and outer conflict, and they quiet the mind. They don't quiet the mind completely, but they move you from a point of total chaos one step closer to integration and quiet, right? Less conflict with the outside world means a quieter mind, right? Being honest is a quieter mind. Being more integrated with other people's requirements is a quieter mind, right? Being less a slave of one's compulsive addictions, right? Is going to result in a quieter mind, right? Which is why I'm always recommending psychoanalytic psychotherapy and things like that as ways of quieting the mind. So, there's a series of stages that people can pass through from noisier and extremely, slaves to the outside world type minds, and we want to move them closer and closer, from more chaotic desires to less chaotic desires, and from more outward desires to more inward desires, right? So someone whose pleasures come from, let's say, art or something like that, clearly is going to have a quieter mind than someone whose pleasures come from violence. So we're moving the minds to quieter and more integrated states, less outer conflict, less inner conflict. Why? Because that builds up the capacity for concentration. And the heart of the search is concentration. Concentration and a looking inward. So we are moving the mind from the outward to the inner, right? And again, that quietness is not in and of itself sufficient to the goal. It's a necessary thing, because the goal is something permanent. The goal is something permanent. Inasmuch as there is a mind, a quieter mind is, of course, a happier mind. And a quieter mind leads ultimately to realization, so to say, quote unquote. And if there is a mind after that, or if there's said to be a mind after that, which is a debatable point, realization will continue to quiet the mind. Anyway, that's getting off track. The point is that there are powerful methods of quieting the mind that are short of the final spiritual goal, but they are very useful because they get the seeker to come closer. They come closer to it. They're not all the way there, but they come closer to it. And so some of these methods might include things like pranayama, which is breath control, or the sound meditations that I mentioned earlier, things like that. I mean, there are all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of ways that one might, increase concentration, okay? And frankly, even self-inquiry and surrender are such concentration methods. But they are a little bit separate and distinct and special because they also can go, quote unquote, all the way, whereas these other methods cannot. They can only bring one to a relative state of peace. So, what happens is that when one grows more and more peaceful, and especially if that peace, even if they are temporary states of peace that are not, quote unquote, all the way to realization, if one can induce those states through various methods, including inquiry and surrender, one grows much, much, much less attached to the outer objects of desire, because the mind starts to recognize that there is happiness to be found in inner objects of desire, which are so temporary, but they're far less temporary and far less subject to change than the outer objects of desire. And in that process of becoming, quote unquote, addicted to inner peace of some kind, the so-called attachments to outer objects and outer identities, all those vasanas, they start snapping. And the whole mind turns inward and inward and inward and inward and inward. And ultimately, that inward turning away from the outer objects of desire and towards the inner object of desire is 99% of the search. And if one pursues that truly with all one's efforts, the truth is it can even be 100%, because there is such a thing as grace, right? That final step anyway is grace, and cannot be fully accomplished by individual effort. It's something beyond the individual that intervenes. So someone who pursues a path even of something like sound meditation, if they do it with a true, pure heart and absolute desire, I mean, there's always a room for divine grace to lead them all the way, is the truth. But the point is that there's a reprogramming of the mind away from desires and fears born out of identity towards inner objects of desire, including the peace generated through various methods. And that this is the vast majority of the search, is disconnecting from, the outer objects of desire and seeking inner objects, seeking inner bliss, seeking inner peace. finding inner happiness, inner satisfaction. Which is why Maharishi says, once you've gotten that peace, it need not be disturbed. Because to the people he was speaking to, that's what they were capable of hearing at that moment. That's what they needed to hear. Not to be confused with further steps, but this is the bulk of the search. The vast bulk of it, in fact. But for an advanced seeker who has already quietened the mind, that very attachment to an inner object desire becomes the final vasana to be snapped. It becomes the final object of desire, which is still based on identity, still based on identity with the mind. And it's superior to all the other cruder, more unrefined, and more outer objects of desire and fear, but it's still an object. It still comes and goes, it's still temporary, it's still subject to fate, etc., etc. That's insufficient. We're looking for the perfect, the unchangeable, the stainless, the complete, the beyond all opposites, beyond all possibilities of loss, right? States of Samadhi, states of laya, however magnificent, however long, aren't that. And so when one has become relatively addicted to a relatively quiet mind established through one or another process, it should be recognized at that point that one has to detach oneself even from that. And what that means is to not lose yourself in that, right? When you enjoy something, you lose yourself in it, right? You're eating some like delicious ice cream, you lose yourself in it, And if you're engaged in meditation, which you really enjoy, you lose yourself in it. If you obtain some kind of temporary samadhi, you lose yourself in it. When you lose yourself in it, it becomes a laya. It becomes a temporary state of bliss that doesn't abolish ignorance. What you have to do is you have to stay awake and not lose yourself, but to recognize that that quietness is also a state, an object of experience. And with self-inquiry or surrender, to operate on it, right? With self-inquiry, to inquire deeply into who it is that is aware of this samadhi, of this silence. That's not a question to which the mind can actually obtain its own answer. At that juncture, even simply holding the vigilance and the desire to know the answer, simply holding in that stillness is sufficient, right? So we've cleared the space, we've concentrated the mind, integrated it, quieted it, and all that, and now we stay awake and in inquiry deeply, profoundly, repeatedly ask that question while continuing to continuously keep inquiring in order to keep the mind concentrated. You want to keep the mind concentrated, keep it still, and then ask that profound, repeated question, who is it that's experiencing this, or who am I, right? Or if you're surrendering, you try to essentially turn away even from the samadhi, or ask how to surrender even the surrenderer. I mean, all these questions are the same thing. It doesn't really matter which question you ask. The point is to quiet the mind, establish a practice by which the attention is continuously redirected from thoughts and feelings to the quiet silence, and then to stay awake, not lose oneself in the bliss of that silence, but to stay awake and vigilant, continuously redirecting from the thoughts that are coming at you. For there is never a time without thought for the mind. The mind means thought. So to continuously redirect, not believing for a second that one has has finished redirecting and that now one is in a thought-free silence. No. To continuously redirect, and to redirect even away from the samadhi, the temporary samadhi. And to inquire, who is it that experiences a samadhi? Who enters a samadhi? Who exits a samadhi? Because that's the real question. Who is it that's experiencing those states? Or how to surrender even the samadhi, how to surrender itself, how to surrender the surrenderer. And this is why self-inquiry and surrender are kind of complete methods, you might say, because they can bring one a long way along the route of quieting the mind. I mean, they can take them all the way, in fact, right? And then held in awakening while one continues to fend off, or rather redirect, one's attention from other thoughts to inquiry or surrender. Those same methods of inquiry or surrender also constitute the final question. Who am I, or how to surrender the surrenderer? So that's the distinction between laya and samadhi. Samadhi, again, there are other distinctions that can be drawn about it, but these are the relevant distinctions I wanted to bring out, because there is that seeming ambiguity between Maharishi sometimes saying, don't fall into laya, don't fall into this blissful absorption, stay awake, and question it, right? Question it, because even that absorption is a form of duality, essentially, until the veil of ignorance is cut. And him saying in other places, well, effortless peace, that's the goal. It needn't be disturbed. Well, he's saying that to a certain person where that's where they are on the path, and it's sufficient for them, because the truth is they will go along that path, and when they need to hear more, they will hear more. There is an inner guru that is guiding all seekers. All right, I think that's what I needed to say. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments or contact me through the website.